Welcome, Justice Deters. We at the OAFP really appreciate you taking the time to do this for our members and allowing them to get to know you a little bit better and what's important to you. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your background and what has led you back to the Supreme Court race?
Well, I've my entire career has been as a prosecutor, frankly, probably over 30 years. And I was the Hamilton County prosecutor for 26 years in itself. I never thought I would be a judge. I never thought I thought it was going to be boring and I had no interest in it. And a few years ago, um, we had a really bad murder case out of my county. And the guy fled, the defendant fled to Las Vegas, was arrested with multiple IDs. He was trying to leave the country. And he was arrested, extradited back to Cincinnati. And the judge at arraignment set his bond at $500,000. The defense thought it was too high. We thought it was too low, as you would suspect. And it worked its way up the court system. And in an incredibly ridiculous decision, the Ohio Supreme Court, 4-3, set aside about 120 years of Ohio jurisprudence and ruled. And I used to carry this around in my pocket because people didn't believe me. They ruled that when judges set bail, they shall not consider the safety of the community. And I was floored. I could not believe the Supreme Court, by one vote, had done that. And it was the three Democrats on the court and the Chief Justice, Maureen O'Connor, who did this. Now, if you paid attention politically around the country, um, a bunch of states went to no bail states like Illinois and Chicago, New York, and it's been an unmitigated disaster. Well, the progressives in Ohio knew that would never get through the legislature. They knew that would never get through the governor. The governor would never sign something like that. So they did it judicially. They were judicially active and basically changed Ohio law with a stroke of a pen. And after that happened, the only way you can get rid of a bad Supreme Court case is to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot. So I, along with Megan Shanahan, I kind of spearheaded it. Megan called me right away. Dan Hawkins called me right away. Dave Yost called me right away. Governor DeWine called me right away. I put together a campaign to get this constitutional amendment on the ballot, which simply said, judges, when you set a bail, shall consider the safety of the community. And it got on the ballot after we testified in front of the House and Senate, got on the ballot. And 2 years ago, it got 76, 77% of the vote. Obviously, people want their judges to protect it. But that goes to, after that occurred, I realized that one vote meant the difference in the Supreme Court. And I told Governor DeWine if a vacancy occurred, I would be honored if he would consider appointing me. And almost 2 years ago, he did that. And right now in the court, we have four, which I would refer to as originalists, who adhere to the Constitution and the laws and statutes as they were written, not as we wish they were. And that's where the biggest difference in candidates and judicial philosophies falls. The two incumbents running right now voted that judges shall not consider the safety of the community when they set a bail. And they can yell and scream and all this stuff, but the constitutional amendment got on the ballot, and they kept saying, "Well, this doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make it." Well, why are you campaigning against it then? Because they did vehemently campaign against that amendment. Anyway, I never thought I would be a judge. I'm now a justice on the Supreme Court. I think that if you're a court observer, you would realize that the court has definitely changed with this single vote. And right now, there's three seats up. it's the other party says it's the only Supreme Court in the country where they can flip the court to Democratic control. And people need to decide, do you want to elect judges that follow the Constitution and the statutes as they're written? Or do you want judges who wake up one day and decide that it shouldn't be that way and they're going to change it? And that's a very dangerous thing for judges to do. When judges don't stay in their lane, you get activist courts like we had a few years ago. You get activist courts which aren't following the Constitution. They're highly unpredictable, which affects the medical community, the legal community, the business community. Everyone's affected when the Supreme Court is not consistent with what they do. I get asked all the time by reporters, well, how will you rule in this particular issue? And I say the same thing every time. You want to know how I'm going to rule? Read the Constitution and read the statute. I'm there to follow my oath, and I'm going to do it, even if I disagree with the law, even if I disagree with the constitutional amendment. I swore an oath, and I will follow that. And in that way, for your members, for other people, that it's a very predictable outcome. It wasn't that long ago that the Supreme Court of Ohio was changing the rules on insurance almost every other month. And the insurance companies had no idea how they were going to quantify their potential risk in their business because the rules kept changing. And to ludicrous ends, by the way, if you're familiar, if you have anybody in your organization is familiar with liability and how the Supreme Court was acting in the 90s, you would see how that was going on. Anyway, it's a long answer to say why I'm here, and I'm running right now. And I think if people decide ultimately that they want a judge who stays in their lane and follows the Constitution, that I'm going to be successful.
Thank you for sharing. You touched a little bit on judicial philosophy. What would you say is your judicial philosophy?
An originalist or a textualist. I don't know if your members know what that means, but basically it means that we take the words written in the Constitution and the statute that we're ruling on, and give the words of that statute the meaning they had when they were written, which lends itself to an originalist philosophy. But that used to be the way judges were always across the country. And somewhere in the 60s, the US Supreme Court and other courts around the country started to fudge on that and started to inject their feelings on what the law should be versus what the law is. And again, highly unpredictable. It depends who's the judge. Highly unpredictable. And in my mind, politically speaking, highly dangerous. If you want to change the Constitution, if you want judges, this is my position, if you want judges that don't consider public safety when they set a bail, then do it through the legislature and the governor. Well, they knew they couldn't do that, so they did it judicially. It should not be done judicially. That's very dangerous, because it might be great for you this week when your party controls the Supreme Court, but next week it could be totally different. So all I can tell you is, with me and certainly with the other three that are currently there, we follow the Constitution.
Thank you. The country experiencing polarizing political factions and an increase in partisanship, how can the court system be a model to promote civil discourse?
Well, I mean, I'm sure people are going to be running goofy ads. I've won my last 10 elections, and I'm so used to being attacked for whatever dumb reason. And I suspect it'll happen again this year. I think, in my mind, the way courts would not contribute to a political mess, so to speak, is to be an originalist, to be consistent, because if you're electing a judge because they will rule in favor of their party's agenda versus a constitution, that is what causes division. That's why people will always say, well, how are you going to vote on this? How are you going to, well, I'm going to vote the way the Constitution says I should vote. I don't care what the Republican Party says. I don't care what Governor DeWine says. I am going to vote according to my oath. And that should end the political discourse. Unfortunately, we do have progressive judges in Ohio that promote an agenda outside of I think outside of their oath, and it's a very dangerous thing. So, in my mind, if you're an originalist, you get the politics out of it, because you're not there to carry the water for any party. You're there to carry the water for the people of the United States and Ohio, and that's it.
Thank you for sharing. Would you mind sharing what your most difficult case has been and how you handled that?
Well, I've tried a lot of murder cases. It's nothing to brag about, but I probably have more people, I'm sure I do, have more people on death row than any other prosecutor in the state of Ohio by a long shot. Um, cases involving, to me, cases that I would handle, and I tended to gravitate towards them, were cases involving children. And I've prosecuted, believe it or not, in Cincinnati alone, as prosecutor, I've prosecuted 5 serial killers. My first serial killer was a nursing assistant in a hospital, by the way, who killed 23 patients there, 24 maybe. I can't remember. No, it was late 80s. Anyway, we've had a couple of cases that affected me personally, just because the victims were innocent young kids, and it's heartbreaking to see families go through that. Many of your members probably have lost a loved one suddenly due to a heart attack or a stroke or something that's unexpected. Could you imagine if that happened to a family member and you knew somebody was responsible for taking them from your life? It's a totally different form of grief in my mind. And when it's a child, it is pure torture. What I loved about my old job was I was able to deliver justice to people in those really bad circumstances. And those were probably the toughest cases, but also probably the most fulfilling professionally.
Thank you. Can you describe one instance where you faced an ethical dilemma and how you resolved it?
Well, I mean, I've handled multiple cases involving public officials, and I've always carried out my duty. We work closely with the police when I was prosecutor. Now, we're not the police's lawyer; we're the people's lawyer. But you do work with cops a lot, and you get close to cops. And probably one of the hardest ones, we had a University of Cincinnati police officer who claimed he was dragged. He was just untrained and in urban policing, and he pulled his gun and shot this guy in the head. And the police unions were all mad at me because I charged this cop. Well, I can't help it. I love the police, but I'm not going to give somebody a pass on murder. It's just not going to happen. And that, people say, how that's pretty difficult. Well, if you follow your oath, if you do what you swore to do, it's pretty simple. It really is. As a matter of fact, when we screened with the state FOP this year, they endorsed my opponent. And when they were asked why they endorsed my opponent, they said, because I prosecuted this cop and my opponent is African American, and they wanted to have diversity in their endorsement. And I've said publicly, if I was my opponent, I wouldn't want that endorsement. Oh, let me see. We endorsed his opponent because he prosecuted a cop who murdered somebody, and they should get a pass for everything. And my skin color. I wouldn't want it, but whatever. The FOP can do whatever they want. Um, it would be nice if they knew who has stood with them for 30 years, but they can do whatever they want. I'm going to win anyway, so it doesn't matter. I'm not too confident, am I?
Lastly, what are your beliefs on volunteering and community service being a necessary commitment for persons holding public office? And what types of volunteering and community service have you been involved in?
So I've always been involved in some charity work. I was on the Leukemia Society's Board of Trustees for some time, and I actually ran 2 marathons for team and training, which I'll never do again. But I was on the Board of Trustees at the University of Cincinnati, which obviously is unpaid, and it's just basically volunteer work for the university. And oh my gosh, I was active going all the way back to college. I did mission work with the Glen Mary Home Missioners in Ohio and in Eastern Kentucky. I think it's important. I don't think it's mandatory. People can do whatever they want with their life, but I get a lot of satisfaction out of it, and it's helpful to keep my sanity.
Well, thank you so much, Justice Deters, from everybody at the OFP. All of our members find these interviews to be so helpful, and we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with us.
Thank you. I'll see you guys later. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Justice Stewart, for meeting with me today. The OFP really appreciates it, and it gives our members such a unique chance to get to know you and what you stand for. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself and what's bringing you back to the Supreme Court race.
Well, as you just noted, I'm Justice Melody Stewart. I've been on the Supreme Court completing my first term on the court. I am running for re-election to a second term on the court. I believe that I have served our state well as an elected official, as a jurist on our highest court. And I ran on a platform in 2018 of hoping to make our court more efficient, more effective, and more transparent, and really being better serving the people, the state of Ohio, who use our courts, and to add a dimension and level of diversity intellectually and background that our court didn't have. As I complete my first 6-year term on the court, that 6 years combined with the 12 years I spent on the Court of Appeals before that makes me the most experienced appellate jurist currently sitting on the court. And so I think there's more work to do. I'm a better Supreme Court justice now than I was as a Supreme Court candidate 6 years ago. And so I'm hoping that that your members and the rest of the state will see fit to put me in for another 6-year term.
What would you say is your judicial philosophy?
It's really fairly simple. It's to apply the law as written, and to the extent there is some ambiguity where a law, statute, or case law, constitutional provision needs interpretation, then it's interpreted within the confines of our appellate review, and to not lose common sense, to try to give meaning to the words of the statute or the words of the constitutional provision. But again, for me too, it is not losing sight of common sense. So for instance, there are clerical errors, or what seems to me obvious a clerical error in drafting of amending a statute at some times. And so then I go back and look at the historical nature of why the statute came about, or some of the notes as the law went through committees, and what the legislature intended. And that informs my decision making too on cases, and is not to apply legal concepts so broadly that they just do a sweeping, it's not a sweeping application of everything, and sometimes facts make application of the law a bit different. And so it's always keeping those factors in mind.
Thank you. With the country experiencing polarizing factions and an increase in partisanship, how can the court system be a model to promote civil discourse?
Well, unfortunately, I think the courts are going in the wrong direction. Sad but true. I mean, the politicization of our courts is ramping up, as even evidence in my own race in this court this year, having a sitting colleague run against me because I'm a different political party, and that's never happened in the history of the court before. And that was done because a change was made in the law a few years ago to make some of our judges, not all, but some, run with party affiliation on the ballot for the general election. So this will be the first time in all the campaigns I've ever run, all the judicial races I've been in, where I will have a party designation under my name. I think that further erodes the confidence that people have in the judiciary. I don't think people want to be before a judge as a party or as a juror or as a witness and wonder, I wonder if that judge is Democrat or Republican. And so I think, unfortunately, the civil discourse will likely only ramp up. I know I've even felt it within myself in my own campaign, which is disheartening to me. And I hope that that reverses its course sometime in the not too distant future.
Thank you. What would you say has been your most difficult case, and how did you handle that?
My most difficult case. Well, I guess there's different levels of difficult personally, difficult intellectually, difficult in the broad scheme. But the first case, I guess, that popped in mind when thinking about that question was a case I had as an appellate court judge, as opposed to a Supreme Court judge. It was a criminal case where someone was convicted of murder of his girlfriend, and it got to us. Actually, it didn't get to us directly on appeal. The conviction was upheld on direct appeal. And years later, when DNA testing got more sophisticated, a post-conviction relief motion was filed to test DNA scrapings under the fingernail of the victim who was strangled. And at the time of the trial of the defendant, that technology was not advanced enough to do any profile from the fingernail scrapings. The victim had been sexually assaulted, and the semen found in her did not match the person who was convicted of killing her. And the trial court granted post-conviction relief and order testing, saying that if the DNA profile does not come back and match the defendant, it will prove his innocence beyond a reasonable doubt. So it was not done on state taxpayer funds. Testing happened. The results came back, did not match the defendant. Not only did the results not match the defendant, it matched the semen that was deposited in the defendant, yet the trial court still upheld his conviction. And it got to us, that decision got to us on appeal, and I thought it was a slam dunk reversal, but two of my colleagues saw it differently. And that was a difficult time because even if the evidence, even if he were guilty of the crime, which he was not, the evidence was not sufficient to convict him of this crime. And I wrote a pretty scathing dissent about that case, and I could not understand how my colleagues could find differently from what the transcript told us and what the evidence told us and what just everything told us about the case. And so that was a difficult time, having to write a dissent and be satisfied with that dissent, that was all I can do, and believing that an innocent man was in prison, had been in prison for quite some time, and would spend probably the rest of his life there. So that was a difficult one for me. I'm glad to say that he was later exonerated, but at that time it took years, and you have to be finished with the case. And ironically, I would pass the building where the crime took place when I would go to mass on Sunday mornings. And sometimes when I stop at the light and look at that building, which is abandoned and should be torn down, I would think to myself, I would pray for him and pray for the victim's children. She left two small children. and hoping that if indeed he's innocent, that one day he would see the light of day, and he did.
Thank you for sharing. Can you describe one instance where you faced an ethical dilemma and how you resolved it?
Um, there was, I try not to get into those ethical dilemmas too much, but there was a case once where I sat again as an appellate court judge and heard the case. No, I'm sorry. I was at an event and an old elementary school friend of mine was telling me about a case of one of another person I went to school with. I wouldn't say a friend, and was telling me details about this case, and it really seemed um, strange. And I was asking quite a few questions on it. Little did I know that that case would come up to us on the court, and I was assigned to the case. And it didn't dawn on me until I got halfway through the oral argument that this was the case that was discussed with me. And so I still had no qualms. I think about my impartiality, but I discussed the case with someone outside. And so I went to the administrative judge at the time and said, you know, this case was discussed with me, and it didn't dawn on me until after midway through the argument. And so we I recused myself, I pulled myself off the case, and the case had to be re-argued again before the two judges who were on the panel and then a new judge, because I just didn't think it was appropriate for me to decide a case that I discussed outside of, the confines of the court and with my colleagues.
Lastly, what are your beliefs on volunteering and community service being a commitment for persons holding public office? And would you mind sharing some of the types of volunteering and community service that you have been involved in?
Sure. I think it's one part of my job as an elected official, and then I think it's part of my responsibility just as a citizen. So there are various things that we do as elected officials outside of putting on our robes and sitting on the bench. So it's commencement speeches, it's volunteer for moot court and mock trial arguments, it's visiting schools, it's administering the oath of office to people across the state. I take in externs every semester. I take in as many as I can, and I work with them individually. I don't pawn them off on my law clerks. And it's being on boards that we can serve on, such as bar associations and legal aid societies. I am the Supreme Court liaison to the Ohio Access to Justice Foundation. And then in my personal capacity, I volunteer on the holidays to prepare meals for those who are shut in and help deliver those meals. I participate in literacy programs. I used to do, when able to do, legal clinics, but can't give legal advice anymore on the bench, and just garden projects for community garden projects, cleanup days, cleanup weekends, just anything that I can lend a hand to, or where my skill set might be helpful. Before I got to the bench, I was a volunteer juvenile diversion program magistrate, helping non-violent juveniles kind of get on the right track for things. And then, being the first African-American woman elected to the Supreme Court, February is usually a busy month for me, where I'm the flavor of the month. And so it's a lot of various activities involving Black History Month. But again, I just think that's part of my responsibility.
Well, thank you so much, Justice Stewart. We really appreciate your time, and all of our members here benefit so much from these conversations. So.
Great. Thank you for having me.